Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to a fantastic webinar today, Cultivar Selection for Manufacturers and Retail, hosted by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation. My name is Angela Baca, and I'm the Director of Academics at Oaksterdam University, the first and longest running training for the cannabis industry in the world. I'm excited to be your moderator today. We are here because the Department of Cannabis Regulation has provided the Business, Licensing, and Compliance Assistance, or BLC program, to assist equity entrepreneurs in the City of Los Angeles with obtaining a commercial cannabis license and operating a successful cannabis business. Please visit cannabis.lacity.gov for more announcements on the ever-improving BLC program and for live webinars with different subject matter experts, checklists, worksheets, and other management tools you can download and use, links for accessing expert consultants in the BLC coaching program that connects applicants with seasoned cannabis subject matter experts, and we're dropping a link in the chat now for the sign up for these coaching services. You'll also find self-directed online education on important topics relating to running a successful cannabis business through the BLC's Learning Management System, which we'll refer to as the LMS. As part of the city's social equity program, DCR has launched this LMS portal, where you can access recorded webinars, online courses, and digital resources made especially for social equity applicants and licensees. I highly recommend that you take this course and explore more of the LMS if you've not done so already. And again, the links are in the chat for those if you'd like to join. Before we get started, let's take a moment to review some housekeeping rules. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and can be viewed after the editing process on DCR's website in the LMS I just mentioned. You will be muted with cameras off for the duration of the webinar. This means that your camera and audio functions will not be available during this session. However, you will be able to see and hear all the experts on the panel. There's an open chat box where you can interact with one another for networking or comment on the information. Please use caution when sharing personal information in a public forum and keep your questions focused on today's topic. Please ask questions about today's subject in the Q&A box. We're gathering and responding to your questions throughout the presentation, and we'll have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the event. You're encouraged to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom panel of your Zoom screen. If you use the Q&A box for questions, everyone can see the answers to them. If you have this question, many folks likely do too. Excuse me. Finally, please note that today's content was not created by the Department of Cannabis Regulation or the City of Los Angeles. Excuse me. It's for informational purposes only. Now it's my esteemed pleasure to introduce you to today's subject matter expert, Jeff Jones. Jeff has provided expertise in the medical cannabis field for more than 30 years, playing a major role in California becoming the first state to legalize medical and adult use cannabis. Jeff co-founded the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative in 1995 to dispense medical cannabis to patients. With Jeff's assistance in 1998, the City of Oakland became the first U.S. city to contract with a medical cannabis provider, implement a successful program to issue business permits, and help Alameda County issue patient ID cards. Jeff has been an instructor with Oaksterdam University since its founding in 2007, and he helped as a co-proponent for the Proposition 19 Control, Tax, and Regulate Cannabis Act. Many of today's laws are based on Jeff's blueprint, down to a calling dispensary rather than a club. Welcome, Jeff Jones, and please start your presentation.
Okay. Thank you, Angela. Sorry about that frog in your throat. So today, we're going to have a very interesting time in our webinar because the approach that we're going to take is to try to make you understand why a cultivar is important, why the term strain that you've heard about both in the retail and manufacturing side that comes out of the garden here in the cannabis world is both a differentiator, a useful term sometimes to enter into product identifiers, but is not always the best term and it could be modified and it may still be evolving as our industry grows and matures into where we're going to land in the long-term swing of things as we've come out of a desperate movement in the past that I was part of so many decades ago, as Angela mentioned. We're going to mention why the cultivar matters, the differentials about what in the practices of vending and cultivation might actually affect what the outcomes are. And then we're going to discuss some of the strategies about how to navigate both the flowers that are cultivated and also the many other products that come out of it, mainly the extracts that are developed into a whole niche marketplace that's now not a niche anymore. It's gaining ground and has become 30 to 40% of the traded commerce over the counter. And then, of course, we're going to get into some of the factors that affect the quality at the end, and then some of the takeaways that we want you to walk away with, the things that we see are the most important factors when it comes to your understanding in the retail and manufacturing environment of why these particular varietals, the cultivars, some term them strains, matter and what it's going to continue to matter because sometimes it's consumer driven and not just about what we would want to describe a term, right? Now, oh, so desktop just went away from me. Now, in defining a cultivar, the the main, I think, point that we would want to hit on is that a lot of terms that have come up are not necessarily the best describers. And I think in the past, our science was more about what was discussed in the underground. And I think we derived a term that's used quite standardly in our industry named strain. And that's how we differentiate one, what we'd say plant type versus another plant type. So we call this a strain and that a strain. And in the agricultural world, it doesn't really fit because it's more in the bacterial and virus world that you determine what strains are. So we look at them as cultivars, and a cultivar is a plant that has been derived out of the open market, so to say, the feral world, and pulled forward because of characteristics, because of the smell factor, maybe the food value that was involved in it, and for our purpose with cannabis, because of the content, the actual chemical properties that are in it. And we then cultivated that forward and picked out why it's important to us and then identify its pattern of growth, why the characters are present. And then we try to replicate it, whether it's from seed or it's from a clone or a cutting, as we like to term it here in the cannabis world. Now, I think the important thing is that it touches on other agricultural products. And I think one to look at as the great kind of connected analogy is apples. And I've been involved in this industry for so long that we felt early on that cannabis fit more of an apple profile. When you look at these apples, each one of these is a cultivar coming out of a scientific kind of named area of the more or less the cultivated apple species. And sometimes it's called a domesticated apple, but many times it's more or less just defined into this pit that all of these varietals come out of. And when we term it a varietal, it means that we grew it from a seed, we found that type of character, and then we moved it forward and continued to cultivate it. And in the case of apples, and I thought with cannabis for a very long time, you cannot get what's pictured here from growing it ever again from a seed. So in the bottom left, the red delicious, the golden delicious in the middle, or likely the Braeburn that's off to the bottom right. Those were started from one seed many years ago. And then once they found the varietal that they liked, the smell, the taste of that apple, the palate cleanse that it would give you, they grafted it and cut it and moved it forward continuously, not ever to be grown from a seed again. And if we take the seeds off these apples and regrow them, we're never going to get the stable apple that we would want as that cultivar. So we may have many differential plants underneath of it, but we have one or two genuine type apples that we know about from the grocery store. So where we might grow a different type of apple in our yard, when we go to the store, we may never find that apple. We're going to find what's presented to us, usually grown out from a clone graft, because that cultivated species that we like was brought forward to be that definer for us to pick from and eat. And I think a great example that we're getting into more is looking at cannabis less maybe like an apple, because we can control the hybridization of the seeds crossing back or selfing back the female plant to itself in cultivation and getting something that's a true stable F1 seeded hybrid. That can't be done with apples. And so we could never really get what we would want to be stable varietals or cultivar species in apples, but we can in cannabis. So cannabis may fit more like a mustard plant. where we can get specific varietals out of it that we humans have drifted. Now, what you see pictured here, they all look like different vegetables, different produce that you're going to buy at the market, right? They all come from one plant. And we derived the rest of these cultivated varietals out of the wild mustard, upper left. So all of these species, whether we're talking about kale, collard greens, which are the leaves that we've collected, the cabbage, which are the terminal buds, Brussels sprouts, which are lateral buds that grow off to the sides, right? Broccoli, cauliflower, those are flower clusters, kind of like what we know about because we cultivate cannabis for flower clusters. And then you can get into other things like bok choy, turnips, radishes, watercress. They didn't know it, but all of this came originally from the wild mustard species that we cultivated and kind of picked the character and then drug out the character of that varietal forward into what we now know as that plant that we buy at the grocery store. And what's neat about this is I think cannabis fits more into this world where we have yet to see the varietals that we are going to cultivate out forward and then come to know and love. We've just gotten into the regulated industry. We've barely experimented with it. And remember, none of this that's pictured here was brought to us by genetic modification or by CRISPR gene editing. This was just done by natural selection of the cultivator, the farmer, picking out the winners and then moving them forward and then picking out more winners and going forward many levels of that offspring and controlling the outcomes, taking notes and then redoing it. And so breeding gives us that control, but it doesn't always control the outcomes because part of that is left up to how it's cultivated. Now, the genetics may be the same, as we talked about with the apple, cutting a genetic clone, planting it, and getting the same Red Delicious apple for over 100 years. Yeah, and Red Delicious is one of my favorites. And when you go to the market, you can guarantee when you pick up that Red Delicious, it's the same variety because it's been cloned forward, not grown from seed. But some changes occur in the field because of the nurture effect, the environment that it's grown in, whether it's arid or water, whether there's certain different types of elemental limitations or even disturbances that can cause the tree not to do well and then do really well and flourish. That can affect what comes off the plant. So while we grow from the same genetic material with some clones, especially in the cannabis world, if you've ever participated in cultivating, you can know sometimes every round of the same material can come out differently. And that's how you nurture the plant, the environment that it's grown in. Sometimes the seasonal differences of temperature or outside light availability can affect what the plant's going to do, even though genetically we're starting from that same base clone. Now, we also might look at the consumer effect. With cannabis, it's really tough because for many years we thought we were going to pin down why cannabis does this with this person or this with another person. I don't know if we're ever going to put a pin on that because subjectively, people effectively are affected different by the plant. When they use a little bit of it, sometimes it can have a very powerful effect. When another person uses a lot and they don't feel like they're getting any effect. And that may be something to do with the consistency of the cultivars, how they're grown, but it may also have to just do with body chemistry and the difference of this plant not fitting into a depressant or a stimulant when it comes to what kind of drugs are within it. It's kind of different in the sense it's a euphoriant or in its own chapter. When you look at drug abuse or any type of other classification, cannabis is very unique. And so we think we have to look at the nature that we grow the plant in is affected by how we nurture it through the process, engaged, farmer trying to guarantee outcomes of good success. The plant just wants to procreate. It doesn't understand what we're doing to it by harvesting the flowers, getting them into a manufacturer usable product, whether it's flowers that are used for smoking or flowers that are used for extracts and manufacturing. The plant just wanted to produce seeds because it doesn't live through the cloning process. Only we are generating that next outcome. So I think that while we think that strains or varietal names are a good way to market the plant, they're not often reflectively identifying the genetic material even. So if you go buy a clone or a varietal flower that's at a retail center or you're buying it to sell and provide, it's not always the same plant. There's many studies and reports that have shown that when they've tested the varietals, the genetic material is way different than what the name is saying. And they're not always consistent across the board with even what the genetic material might be close to being matched to. That has a lot to do with legality the early emerging industry that we're in. And long term, I think we're going to get more provenance, much like wine, where you can't call wine varietals certain names without having connected to the grape that it was grown from. I think we're going to get closer to that, but it's not always in the sense with cannabis and the naming of the varietal or the strain. It may be more to do with marketing, and it may be more to do with how it's presented to the consumers that have had very little to hold on to, and sometimes very little exposure to the marketplace. And they're being educated by the bud tenders, both the marketing that's coming at them and how they might have an effective user experience. So the things that they kind of latch onto is how to navigate that subjective effect. And a lot of times it's in the name of what they've heard that varietal or the strain that they were using called. But as we'll learn about with extracts, it may not be much to manage because they provide batches of different plants into the same amount of material they produce extracts out of. So it becomes more of a batch model where they're mixing plants together to get the desired outcome of what is in the extract itself. And so it could be a way of genetically navigating. I know that varietal names are heavily used in the cultivation world. They're becoming less used sometimes in the manufacturing world. You don't always buy a soda or a beverage that's been infused with cannabis by name. You're not buying a Granddaddy Purple beverage. You're buying a beverage that tastes like cranberry juice. And so everybody's knowing that there's going to be a desired effect from the beverage, but they're knowing less about where that material came from. But when it comes to inhalable flowers, vaporizers, some of the products that carry the flavor forward, the genetic material, where the naming came from, it kind of sometimes does matter because somebody that wants a flavored taste wants to know that it's got a cushion in it or some type of a, Granddaddy Purple effect or a train wreck because of the fruitiness of it. So while it's not always the most desirable system, it's what we have to go by. It's been the benchmark of what the consumers have kind of known and understood. And we hope to see it kind of engaged more in a professional way where the varietals are going through the system and kind of fit the provenance of what they're being called. But we're not completely there yet. So don't think that the name always meets the marketed material. It's what is being derived out of the cultivation practice. And hopefully long term, that's going to shift into a better place. Where most of the thoughts with the naming came from in the sense of just to look at cannabis versus indica and sativa, that had more to do with the farmer and then was passed to the consumer because the farmer had very little to tell the consumer about what was going on. And a great way to look at it is with this physical morphology picture about the plants themselves. And that cannabis kind of breaks into a couple of different varietals that you can commonly see physical character from. The equatorial sativas, which are on the left, they grow really tall and lanky, kind of like me and skinny and they have a lot of windability and blowing in air because they grow in a very humid environment. If they were too compact, they would mold and get lots of pathogens and have no good seeds to have any offspring from. Where in the middle, we have a different varietal that is mainly grown in the northern and southern latitude areas of the world and is otherwise termed as indica, but it is more small and squat and stubby and grows much more like a shrub and is usually finished in very fast in maybe 8 weeks. And I used to tease when I teach cultivation classes a lot for Amsterdam that the reason why it was getting done so fast is it was rushing to not freeze. Northern and southern latitudes risk freezing before the end of their season, and sometimes dip it intermittent weather that can take out the whole growing crop before it even gets to seed. Where in the tropics, would the plant on the left ever risk freezing? No. So they flower much longer. Equatorials can flower 10, 12, 14, 15 weeks, where the middle plants usually finish flowering in about 8 to 9.5 weeks. And so they grow differently. They use a lot less water towards the end and sometimes very little and they can be less lit, where the ones on the left need lots of light to produce bountiful flowers and to be productive and kind of get to their most productive space. And then the varietal that we like to say is more of a trait now, we've identified over time and science, and less a specific species or a subvarietal itself is ruderalis, known as an autoflower. And we've now come to understand that we can take autoflowers for cultivation practices and breed that trait back into either of the varietals that you see here listed as indica and sativa. I like to say equatorial and northern and southern latitude, meaning that they're more about the demographics of the landrace area about where they're being grown, because kind of the land race is the best way to identify cannabis is where is the heritage of the mother plants, the heritage of where the plant was coming from. You're going to know a little bit about the habitat, about how it wants to grow. Does it need a lot more light like the ones on the left, the equatorial plants, or can it get by with a little bit of light, which is much more economical, faster growing, much more economical. It can save an electric bill for cultivators. So it's much more priced accordingly. When you see retail cannabis flowers in California, 95% of them are the indica hybrids that are grown in 9.5 to 10 weeks at the most. You see very little equatorial plants that may change across the marketplace as the consumers mature and they start to understand what's coming from the equatorials, the different smells, the reason why Acapulco Gold and Panama Red were popular. They were equatorials. They had something unique in them that didn't have with other varietals. And that's what you're going to see, I think, in the future as the cultivation experiences mature a little bit and we see some stabilized ways to identify and adopting federal legislation that allows for everything that we've been talking about. Being still a Schedule One, cannabis is kind of shunned from being regulated by organics, things that are normal in the agricultural world. And that includes correct naming and pedigree kind of quality of having provenance. And well, yeah, I think the main thing to come across with this slide is that we named cannabis mainly because of the hemp plant and that hemp was widely used for industrial purposes. It was out generically being grown, and that the cannabis plant being looked at for drug purposes or medicinal purposes had a very limited production quality, and it was came from very limited places in the world, including most of it being imported in from India in the early days because of the heavy production medicinal background there for many years. Um, I think that the concept of cannabis on the marketplace right now, most of them are hybrids. Most of them are grown specifically for high THC and or other types of fragrance qualities that we're going to get to in a moment about what separates some of these varietals or strains, as they've been called, apart from each other and why you get fruity smells in some, earthy smells in others, and very gassy, heady smells in other varietals. And I think that's where the market is going to be leaning to if we can talk about the maturity of where things are going, both in the cut flower market and in the extract market. I think that there may be something to say with some aromatherapy connection to the plant, that the smell factors alone have an entourage effect to the overall potency of the plant flower, both in manufactured products, but also just in regular over-the-counter flowers themselves. And I think that the the varieties themselves are going to have trouble until we get to a universal naming standard, until we get to the point of that accepted provenance value about where we can go backwards and show where it came from so that folks understand where it is. It may not be very important when it comes to extracts, even manufactured products, as I mentioned, edibles and different types of liquid products and beverages. You don't really buy them known for their being made from this particular plant varietal. It's known for having a potency check, a serving size dosage, a controllability, and then the flavor of that beverage or that candy confection that the consumer wants. So there may be some separation here with why some varietals are grown. They have a high washability content. They get good potency results on tests, and they can be made into products where others are chosen because of the hype around a varietal's name to be smoked or used in a vape pen, which is going to come with a little bit more control and standardization because the consumer is going to want to have that taste factor, that known varietal. And I would draw the analogy that if you like coffee or you like tea, when you make that cup, you always want it the same way. Once you find how you like it, and that's why the MSOs, the big companies like Starbucks and Peet's are popular because when you go in and you order the one that's on the line, you're getting that exact same beverage, whether you order it here or in DC. And that is partly what the naming conundrum has been, is we've not had that standardization kind of under on the cultivation side to allow all of the plants that are coming up through retail and manufacturing to have that similar kind of notation. And that may be something that shifts a little bit, specifically in the cut flower world, but may never completely arrive in a way that's meaningful to the extract or manufacturing world because they do them in batches. And a lot of times they're buying in things that are leftovers from many different cultivation products projects to more or less combine into one large batch to make manufactured goods out of. And it's less about the name of that material that it was derived from and more about the content quality and lacking of insecticides, pesticides, or contaminants that might be in the material specifically for extractors. Their biggest concern is contaminated material that then gets condensed down and makes it worse when you get it out. So we're hopeful that the labeling standards and where we're headed is going to shift tremendously as we see the market mature and the understanding of things. And that I think gives good hope to retailers and manufacturers as the price stabilizes and we now want to understand why the cultivars matter and the practice of what is going on kind of behind the scenes and the thought about the scientific accuracy and the classifications being limited. Um, I think it's going to be up to the consumers to kind of set the tone because even if a manufacturer wants to produce a product that has a specific name, if it's not liked by the consumers or the name doesn't match what the outcome is, it may not be popular. It may never catch on. And so I think the retailers and the manufacturers have a lot left for them to kind of listen to the ground and understand where the market is leading to catch up to how they're going to present those products and kind of be on that kind of leading edge of product development, especially if you're manufacturing. If you're retailing, it's trying to carry what's popular and understanding about some of the effects and the procedures that are in place about why customers are seeking those products. And most consumers are not having a lot of exposure. They have less exposure than in the alcohol and tobacco world. And some of those products are not very wide. Tobacco is just a few, but they understand what they are. They kind of get a gist. And if they want a desired effect, they know how to get it. Most consumers that walk into a retailing facility are left with a lot of questions and they don't have a lot of time to talk to the retailer about what they want. And so they go by naming structures mainly. They go by what is the varietal name, even though the name may not have a lot of connection to what's in it. And we mentioned here chemotype. For those that don't know the difference of chemotype, we have phenotype, the physical character of the plant. We have genotype. We talked about the genetics. That's the genetic kind of linkage underneath the plant, the DNA structure about what's going to be presented as you grow it. And then the chemotype, probably the most interesting when it comes to flowers and extracts, which is what is the genetics going to create? Where are the chemical limits? What are the varietals going to have in them, both the terpenes and other types of things that could be flavors? That's where a lot of the market is leaning into, and a lot of the popularity and hype to me comes around what is the makeup of the plant? How is it going to smell? How's it going to be presented? Does it look visually pleasing if it's sold as a cut flower? Um, Aesthetics has a lot to do with what's been popular. And so while the name may play a large role with consumers, it's also how it's presented to the consumer. And I can't say the market itself has been friendly to the consumer, packaging it up, limiting their ability to look at it, smell it at the point of retail. Hopefully, in the future, when the regulations kind of loosen up a little bit, those abilities will change as we see the concern about why they were limiting them kind of become more clear. And I think the quality is going to go up, and the end consumer is going to expect more. And I think that leaves us to come up with better strategies, right? Because as retailers and manufacturers, we have to understand what we're presenting to that public consumer before they get in our door, before the product is even developed. As Jobs would say, they don't understand what they want. They don't know that they want an iPhone because it hadn't been developed. Similarly, I feel a lot of the products in the cannabis world have yet to be even brought to market or developed in a way that has gotten exposure correctly to the consumers. And I think that's going to give us a lot of area to kind of build marketing and the ability to educate the consumer about some of the things they know very little about. And I go back a long way as retailing. I retailed cannabis on Broadway in Oakland in 1996 to medical patients under the state law that passed. And when I started trying to test the cannabis flowers and release subjective data to the consumers, they didn't want anything to do with it. They didn't think that it was correct. They'd never heard of a THC total, and they didn't think that it valued anything. They were looking at price targets. The higher the price of the cannabis, the better it was. And I was beside myself because I'd worked with some cultivators, low priced, some very high quality product, and nobody thought it was good until they started to test it themselves. So bioassaying, the ability for the patient to get the results and then spread it around the grapevine, did more than posting results. It's flipped over completely today. where now testing results are tracking THC, CBD, terpenes, other types of flavonoids right on the package, specific to the varietal that's being grown. Not all companies do that. Not all farmers have the bandwidth to put it on the packaging. But as you see them trying to make more distinctive approaches, you're going to see a lot more to do with trying to separate themselves out and allow the consumer to get that subjective understanding of how the experience might be effectively different. The terpene content provides an entourage effect. So THC might be at 15%, but if it has a lot more terpenes in that sample, you might feel a lot more effect from that varietal when you use it, whether it's in an edible or in a consumed inhaled variety, than when it's not there. And that is where the market is kind of leaning, is what other things are going to be involved in it, and what other qualifying information and business practices about how it was cultivated, the process involved with how it was produced and cured and gotten to market. All of those things may soon matter, much like in tuna, dolphin safe on the label of the can matters a lot for some folks. May not matter to everybody, but some folks it may matter. And we're going to jump into more details with each one of these and why knowing the vendor, knowing where the cultivated product's coming from may be your best line of attack in the sense to keep stability in your marketplace, but also to have some surety about what's going across the counter or going into your manufacturing process. I know the extractors have been really hard hit with getting in product that's been contaminated. They run it through extracts. It passed the COA as a flower, but it fails once they get it produced into a product. That is knowing the vendor. And we'll get into the detail about why it's super important to not leave that kind of thing to the side. Because whether we're looking with the products that are shown here in a bulk amount of flowers, some type of a smaller amount that might be packaged, or even a testing amount, all of it's going to matter as to how it's packaged, how it's marketed to the consumer, how the value of the material is stored enough so that when they get it, when they finally get to open the bag, the package, the jar, it's going to be what they want. Remember, when you go into Starbucks, if you don't get the coffee you like after you spent your $4 or $5 to $10, you don't go back, especially to that one. They didn't know how to make my coffee. That's damaging to the retail. And it's even more damaging to the product manufacturer. If you don't get them to open your package again, it's a failure. And so we're going to need to have the use of these kind of tools about, I think objective data is going to be one of the better ones that's out there because the COAs are being demanded now by state regulation for retail sellable products, which give us a good determination of quality control, some of the content of the things that we're chasing, which are the cannabinoids, the THC, the CBD, and the other entourage effects that are there. Of course, the target has always been terpenes and whether or not they're present, and then maybe what levels, both in some of the ones that are very well known, and now we're starting to get into these more exotic and more different tones of fruity or earth or gassy smells, as I talked about. And we're of course wanting them to all pass and not have any failures when it comes to contaminants, whether it's a pesticide, a heavy metal, something that is a foreign material that we don't know what's in there because we didn't know how it was manufactured or cultivated. It could have been something from the packaging material that got somehow engaged in the material. And of course, biological contaminants. And that could just be that it's organically grown and had bugs on it when it was cured and cultivated and put together. Organic grown produce is going to have some kind of level of material on it. And we have to learn to how to put that into our effect and why sometimes things are priced differently in the open marketplace. It's not that organics is not good. It's just that it comes with different types of concerns that have to be managed and then marketed accordingly and accepted. And I think a lot of folks look at organics as high quality because it's safer of not being pesticide laden, not having types of uh, pathogen controls or fungus controls that are placed on the plant that aren't organic. So it gives us a control about how it was cultivated. And I think that's important for most consumers because as a retailer, we want all of our consumers to come back with a happy experience and buy more, right? We want none of them to have a negative experience and not try that package again or that product that we're providing them. And I think that's one of our downsides with cannabis is that there is not always a universal experience when it comes to even changed cultivars. And you can hand a varietal in a joint or a vape pen to somebody, they pass it to their friend, and they have two different experiences sitting on the same couch at the same time in the same setting. And so it's hard for that to kind of get into the marketplace. And I think it's a lot to do with people's body chemistry are different and the way that they eat and whether or not they have processed food or natural food in their diet. Could be that they already have some terpenes on board from blueberries or strawberries they ate earlier in the day, and then that makes the cannabis more potent. We have yet to see the test results and the clear factors of what's engaged there, but we do know that cannabis has been shown multiple times to have different user experiences, and it's not always easy to tell a client that it's going to affect them this way. So you kind of have to let them have some subjective quality control there. Now, there may be different ways that it's processed, the production methods, even the ingestion methods that can control the dosing or the effects that are there. Everybody's usually had an experience with inhaling it through smoked flower or through a vape pen. It's got a very fast effect, quick onset, controlled, kind of drops off fairly fast, and the effect is over. When it comes to eating it, drinking it, or edible, intoxication, you don't feel it for a while. The onset is very slow. It creeps up on you over hours. And then about hour two, you're feeling the full effect. And if you didn't know what you were doing with dose control, you might feel like you're on a magic carpet ride. And that for dose control has been rough on consumers. In the early days of retailing, when I was around, most people didn't want to try cookies or any types of the edibles because there was no dose control and they didn't trust what was there and how they were going to be able to go on their day. Nowadays, because of the COAs, because of the objective data that we're using and asserting size limitations with some regulations that are a little restrictive, they've given us a benchmark to work from. So the consumers have circled right back to it and went, oh, I can control this. Oh, I could take a little teeny piece here and it has this effect on this day and it's almost the same effect on the next day. And when we're dealing with something that's super, euphoric, could have a lot more effect when it's an edible type product, we need to have that caution in the wind because we want our customers to rely on the experience, have those preferences and the understanding about how that path goes forward. So understanding how the cultivar is going to affect them, the mix, the dose control, how they're going to use it, their user experience, I think that's going to be both educational for the consumer, but long lasting for our marketplace. If we make happy consumers, we're going to be very popular in the sense of the retailer because they're going to come back to us to continue that experience about understanding. I feel that there is one thing that's really lacking in our industry, and that's user understanding, exposure, and experience education about the products. Things are being developed so fast, the consumers aren't even catching up with what's out there. Again, vaporizers are just so new on the market. Most older folks don't even understand what that whole concept is doing, and they're relying on their fellow consumers to educate them because retailing has been kind of limited on that experience. And that's one thing that we hope to change, right? Because the idea of the profiles that are out there with the terpene contents that are there, the flavors that are present in the plant, they're enticing. I used to tease when I was doing bike delivery in the very early days of the medical cannabis days in California that cannabis would market itself. If you had the right varietal, it smelled the right way, the patient wouldn't let you leave their home with it. They want to get it all because it was what they wanted. And that's what I meant earlier, which it's kind of hard for the retailer and the manufacturer to know what the marketplace wants weeks before, the consumers walked in your door because you got to get it ordered. You got to get it stocked. It's got to be in the system. And that takes time and effort. So understanding a little bit about the consumer's interest. Are they interested in terpene contents? Do they have an association that is going to have a good effect? More and more consumers are looking for COAs to include terpenes and smells and factors that even I didn't understand until just recently as we've done more science to prove that it's not just terpenes. For the longest time, it was all about the terps. If it wasn't talking terps, you didn't have any smell in it. And some folks think that flavonoids are what makes it smell. Kind of more to do with colors. They can affect the taste and the smell a little bit, but it's more bitter and not. And it's more the terpenes that provided that bouquet until we got science back that showed us we were also missing some factors that are in other common foods, things that are shared across the agricultural commodity market that we didn't really even have a light shined on. And now we're having the experience of cannabis helping us understand what other agricultural crops have been doing and how sometimes the smells in them have driven us to use them more readily, make more products out of them. And some of them are looked at it in the sense that we didn't understand that we had tropical volatile sulfur compounds that are very smelly and very profuse with the plant in certain varietals that make it smell like it's exuding sulfurs. We also have varietals that smell like scat or scatoli, which is the smell of some defecation. So there are varietals out there that people have always complained smell like somebody's cat box. Uh, that is because of the material that's in it. And these are not terpenes. These are other types of products that could include things that we always found in those famous cheese varieties. And I didn't like the name cheese in any of the cannabis varieties, but we now know that they were actually hitting on some smells, some flavorants that are found in cheeses. And what makes some of the stinky cheeses hold those odors, they crossed right over into cannabis. And so we have, as a marketing option, some great opportunities because when you walk down the cheese aisle, it turns some people's nose right towards what they want to buy, and others they run away. So it's not going to make everybody happy, but it could be something that drives sales. It could be something that drives more attention towards the product line because it's inclusive of these newer derived tested materials that do affect smells, especially in the flower and the vaporization world. And then we get into analdehydes and other things that are present. I think we're still scratching the surface on what is in the plant and the things that we might see that we're going to be using and gearing towards coming out of the plant. As I said, I think we're still in the wild mustard stage, and we have a lot of cultivar varietals that are going to come out of the plant type. I have my wishes, and many of them are far off. They're pipe dreams. But the concept that we could get there, that's where we have opportunity and why I feel so optimistic about the future where cannabis in the industry is going because when I first started out, we could not even mention organics. It wasn't even a discussion point because you couldn't prove that it was organically grown. It was bought from people that were underground. How do you prove they didn't put something on it? Well, now we have tests to prove it, and we can show that it is grown in a way that is more natural, although the organic term is still elusive because of the scheduling status. Hemp can be called organic. Cannabis, because it still remains a Schedule One, is a little bit on the faux pas side, although we're going to get there hopefully this summer as we get rescheduling more close and completed. But we can use sustainable regenerative farming or biodynamic practices if certified correctly. And of course, local can always be present on the crop. And I always say buy local, whether it's produce or cannabis, because it's less cost and it's going to support the local farmer. And maybe we're going to get to the point where knowing the vendors, knowing their cultivation practice, something about the production, whether or not they do things on a craft level or they deploy auto trimmers. Some things may matter and other things may not matter. If I'm manufacturing, it's going to be mostly cost. And how quickly can you guarantee low cost with high quality and passing all the COA specs? When it comes to cut flowers, it may have to do with fine hand trimming and the differences of whether or not it was craft grown. So those things are going to help define us. And again, we're seeing some emerging practices like ethical business practices, being a B Corp to benefit the community around you because you're local and everybody around you is part of that community. And then also social equity, which I didn't think would have legs when it was discussed firstly in Oakland so many years ago. And now it's across the country and being discussed. And while maybe it's being pressed down right now by the federal government, it kind of ebbs and flows. And I think the equity of us bringing back people that have been affected by the laws first up into the industry itself is only going to have positive developments and ripple effects for decades forward because we've taken something that was a pariah in our society and we've kind of elevated it into being an essential service. Because during the pandemic, all retail businesses were allowed to stay open when all the other businesses were being shut down. I was beside myself. I felt it was one of our best opportune moments of shifting gears into what were now being accepted and kind of regulated right into the regular industries that are there. So I feel quite happy about the fact that while we still can't use organic, we have local state terms that are being pushed forward, like Oregon Tilth, and we have a certified organic standard here in California that is being pushed a little bit more by producers, especially those that are growing outdoors or in areas that are using raised beds, because organic is hard to do inside unless you're doing specific soils. It's difficult. Let me take a quick drink. I don't want to get to a spot where I can't talk because we've got a little bit more ground to cover. Because when we're retailing, we have to have vendors, and those vendors are going to be our growers. May not be direct because we have to deal with distribution. That may be something that shifts also. You have to know kind of the chain of where the product is coming from, and it can help because they may have their own circle of folks. A farm may have folks that are wanting to know where it's being retailed. And when you connect with them and know them, and they do some social media presentation about where it's being, retailed and sold, that may only help you and it may raise all boats, and so to say. I think the social media and the websites that are out there, they have yet to see their true space because we've been being pushed down, not allowing to market on Instagram, Facebook, and other types of main platforms because of the scheduling and the legality status. As that starts to shift, we're going to be looked at as every other marketable commodity. And I think that we're going to have to engineer the same processes that other groups do and engage the same types of social media campaigns and energetic ideas about how we get our marketable product out in front of people. Because again, the biggest thing I see in our industry is the lack of exposure to consumers with products that are going to matter to them, how they're going to engage them, and then the education enough to get them to continue to understand what it's going to do for them. Folks don't have a lot of money, and when they do want to spend something, they want to know they're going to get what they want out of it. And that's partly what our marketing needs to engage is that they want what we have and they're going to get what they expect out of it. And that's, I think, part of what the future is going to hold a lot of. Now, a little different with extracts. We talked about flowers and about the process that they're developed and understanding some of their practices and maybe even how they're cultivated. With extracts, gosh, it's maybe a whole different set of terms because you don't get to see the flowers. So maybe it's the product and the process that's being deployed. Is it used with certain solvents or is it solvent free? Are the processing techniques of a concern? Some folks don't buy extracts. They don't have the process involved right there on the label to show them how it's engaged, what types of chemicals might be there. And then even deeper into the weeds is the terpene sources. What folks are trying to expect and get out of the label is what is present. And we'll get into some of the detail there in a second, because this is just an overview of these slides that are coming up. And then, of course, the ingestion devices. Gosh, it's grown so much. When I was running an accessory store for patients, we had a very limited scope of what was available: pipes, some papers, and then maybe some new things called vaporizers. Nowadays, whoa, the only thing I miss is being a kid when all these devices were out. So again, the idea of how they're compatible, what types of products go in which device, how they're best used, some of that user experience, you point them in the right direction and they get the right advice, they're going to keep coming back because they found that experience exposure that they needed that they were not getting from their friends or their relatives because they don't normally talk about cannabis to everybody in their family. Remember, some of this is still siloed because of the baggage that cannabis had for decades. And again, getting back to the biggest thing is price. And it is starting to drop, even in extracts, where I was at an event and some guys were talking about the good old days of $200 grams. And I'm like, what was good about that? Well, it was manufacturers that were talking. They were like, we were making $200 grams and people were buying them. Nowadays, extracts like you see pictured here are going from 8 to 20 to 30 to maybe $50 a gram. Well reduced, much more affordable to the consumer marketplace, which gives more exposure to these products. And as they've been exposed to the consumers, boy, have they done well. I was listening to folks a decade ago saying extracts are terrible. They're laced with all these chemicals, they're bad. And that was before folks knew that mostly it was terpenes that was in there that was overpowering and they think that they were chemically. And then you understood maybe there's a difference of where the source of the terpenes coming from, because these extract materials can be put into labs and all sorts of things can be done to clean them and recompound them and all sorts of stuff. Terpenes can be produced synthetically and they can be pushed back into products to make them taste and smell much more like one of those varietals that we wanted to know, like Gorilla Glue or Granddaddy Purple or White Widow. You can make it smell a much more that like that varietal with mixing in terpenes to get that desired outcome. And so consumers are going to want to know, where's the source? Are they natural? And then it just goes from there. So when you get into solvent versus solventless, that debate can be quite deep, because whether you're using a solvent like a hydrocarbon, which could be propane, butane, or other types of um, derived petroleum products that isolate the cannabinoids, the terpenes, and some of the flavonoids and pull them out of the extract plant material, leaving them all behind. Sometimes they're not completely full spectrum, but a lot of times, depending upon what it is, it might be the most full spectrum we could get out of the plant because it's leaving the bio plant material, that plant source material behind, and just giving us that trichome oil, that slick that you see pictured here from being pressed. And this could be some of the solventless extractions that are used with either flower material that could be washed with water, pressed with pressure, There's many ways of doing it, but to understand that solvents are kind of being used in a way that may not be completely correct. Because while we call most solvents flammable, most solvents are going to be alcohols, as I talked about, hydrocarbons. I consider water to be a solvent. So if we're doing water washing with ice bags and ice, we're really using the solvent of water to separate the resin from the plant. Just in our case, the solvent doesn't mix with the resin because it's hydrophobic. But in the case of alcohols, in the case of hydrocarbons, it mixes into and gets into solvent, and then you have to dissolve that solvent and dissipate it away, either vaporizing it or condensing it. And with water, you get the material right out. You get sometimes not full spectrum material, depending upon what you're doing. But usually the goal of creating these extracts is to leave the plant material behind and then raise the potency level of the extracted material. We talked about the process, and there may be manual methods, agitation. We talked about pressing between two presses, and also sifting back and forth between screens. And then there's a water method of using cold water and ice and shaking between very fine thread per inch screens, the resin that would sink from the bottom because it's heavier, and then the water kind of floats the plant material up, and we get very clear separation and very controlled results, and sometimes very smelly, full spectrum material. And then you can use hydrocarbons, which are the propanes, the butanes, and what's become more popular and less explosive and safer labs is carbon dioxide solvents, which are high pressurized, critical pressures, pressed in gas that then expels these essence of the plant, sometimes a little dirtier, but they can be cleaned up. And what I mean by dirtier is that when you press your material through CO2 process, sometimes it comes out with a little bit more of the plant material in it. So that can be problematic depending upon what the manufacturing process is, but it may not be a concern at all if it's going into edibles or into products that just don't matter. If it's a taste-oriented vape pen, hydrocarbons are probably top of the scale. Some full spectrum water extractions are also there. And then the term live extracts, just to make sure you understand what it is. It's something that's fairly new. Didn't exist when I was selling back in the 90s. You know, live what? You never sell a live plant. It's got to be cured and dried out and prepared for it to be allowed to be used. Well, what we figured out with extracts is that you don't have to dry out the material to get it extracted anymore. And if you catch it right off the plant wet and then freeze it immediately within minutes, you catch all of that live terpene, live resin, like it was stowed from the plant. And it's literally not converting it all. It's literally able to be frozen just like food and then stored like that for not weeks, but months, both in the plant material form and then also once you get it out of the plant material form into the extract. So live extracts have changed the ballgame when it comes to plant being condensed into a jar. If I want to carry around the smell of a plant in a small little teeny jar, live extracts allow you to do it. And it can last not for a week or 2 weeks or 2 months or even half a year, but for years. So unlike flowers that kind of get a little bit less smelly over time, and up to 6 months they smell stale, extracts can be around for quite some time. Their shelf life at the retail center can be very long, especially stored in cool pantry-like conditions. They undo what limits we have with flowers. So this is huge moving forward. And then it's going to lead to how are we protecting that valued product? Are there terpenes in it? Do the terpenes affect how long it can be stored? Does it butter up or change consistency? Because terpenes are much more like a gasoline solvent, where the resins that we talk about are much more like crystals. And if you dehydrate all the terpenes out of it, it becomes solid like glass. And in the early extract days, all of our stuff was really hard. And that's because we were working with hard material that was dried and cured. When we started working with live resin material, live plants frozen, all of it got real liquefied. So the extracts became much more user friendly. They became much more buttery because they didn't have the lack of terpenes that then allowed for all of the consistent cannabinoids to be mixed and much more pliable. So we're looking at terpene sources probably being one of the focal points in the upcoming years. Are they native to the plant? Are they cannabis derived, which is even more of a focal point because you can get terpenes from many other types of plants. Lavender has terpenes that cannabis shares, as we talked about, cheeses, other types of products. They could become a source to be brought back into the plant if they were cost effective, but maybe people are starting to become aware of that, and they're going to demand that it has to come from the cannabis plant, closed loop. Like if I'm going to buy a skunk number one, I want to know that it doesn't have some other kind of terpene in it to make it smell like skunk number one. And then botanically blended or artificially derived. So are they coming from a plant-based material or are we synthetically making them? And then high terpene extracts. And there's all sorts of opportunities ahead. It gets a little scary because we don't know what all these properties could do, both to the human body and mixed together and contraindicating. But what we found is they usually have a synergistic positive effect, both on the human and on the mixture of what's there. Uh, the aromatherapy potential of where we're going with terpenes, and as we talked about the other flavor and smell factors, I think the sky is the limit. I think we have a lot of opportunities ahead of us because ingestion devices are being developed that can put a pin on some of the quality of the smells and the terpene effect into the body. As I said, when I first got into the industry many decades ago, we had smoking pipes, water pipes, and papers, and then started to see vaporization come to market. And that has just changed the landscape because vaporizing led to vaporizing cartridges, extracts that are put into a little teeny vape tip that then can be used for days, weeks by a consumer that's a very lightweight consumer to just take a sip and then set it down. And because of the exposure of the high potency, the cleanliness of how easy it is to consume, it's become a mainstay. When I was around, if you sold somebody some oil, their only apparatus to use it was a knife and some flaming apparatus that they would burn it and try to sniff the smoke off of it. There was very limited user apparatuses. Now that we've gotten more regulated, much more acceptable, paraphernalia is becoming a developed tool in our industry instead of something that got you a charge. Because paraphernalia sales, when I was a kid, it was felony in some states, and you couldn't buy a pipe with papers potentially if you told them that it was going to be used with cannabis. It was illegal. And so the idea of what's come out of vaporizing, and that now we have dabbing rigs, which is the terminology of taking a dab, a small amount of this extract oil or tar or kind of a buttery material on a small metal pin and dipping it into something that was hot that had a closed chamber connected normally to a water pipe or to some apparatus that you could breathe through. Um, very almost equatable to taking a shot of whiskey. And then I would say flowers are like our beers. And when you get to refined flowers and exotic flowers, they're like our wines. And then when we get to extracts, that's like our spirits and liqueurs. And that we have now seen the full dichotomy of what you see in the alcohol industry developed with cannabis. Are we completed yet? Probably not, because we're developing things that we didn't necessarily see decades ago. Enhanced pre-rolls, for instance, where you're putting infused manufactured products back into the flower. Could be extracts. It could be just seeding keef that you're sifting off of screens and then putting it back into the flower to make it a little bit more potent. And in the old days, people didn't want to buy pre-rolls because they thought you were rolling up the leaf and it was very bad quality and didn't taste very good. Nowadays, joints, pre-rolls are making up a huge market share of the fine cut flower sales, and that's not going to stop. The millennials, the generations of today, they don't want to get their fingers sticky and dirty just to roll up a joint. And their expectation is that they're going to get a very controlled product, something that has a very good outcome. The taste is going to be there as they puff on their cigarette that's been pre-rolled, and they're going to experience what they wanted out of that. As that becomes more of the norm, you're going to see much more people drift that are smokers into pre-rolled material that has the same effect to give them a bag of flowers that they have to roll up or put together themselves into one of the apparatuses that are listed. And that comes at a price. Pre-rolls are a little bit more of a premium cost, but then that gets them to come back to the retail marketplace. I can see time and time again farmers starting to make their own pre-rolls, and they're using infused products because they can condense down, make extracts, and then put that back into their material. And then they're selling a much more enhanced, higher costing pre-roll that the consumer is happy with. Because what the consumer wants is an experience, an effect. And if they get that desired effect from the product, it's easy to use, they're going to cycle back and do the whole thing again, especially if the price is consistent and low enough for them to continue that user apparatus. You don't buy expensive coffee if you can't afford it. You're not going to buy expensive cannabis if you can't afford it. But right now, cannabis has been kind of a premium cost, and the price in the last decade has come down considerably. And it may still come down a little bit more, but not by much. Now, if you're a cultivator, prices coming down doesn't help you. If you're a retailer, it can help you. And if you're a manufacturer, it's going to help you a lot because in the end, the consumer cost is going to be going about flat when it comes to edible and retail, consumer products that are not inhaled. But the cost of those products to be manufactured with very expensive cannabis oils, it's going to drop. And we're going to see much more development of other types of products as the price gets consistent and the consumers start to want consistently priced products that are made correctly. You can't usually buy great manufactured products from a legacy cultivator or from the underground. You're going to want to experience it through the current retail above ground marketplace. It's got COAs, things are done and dried safely, usually in safe kitchens. That is going to become the normal experience. And is what, when I represented patients, what everybody wanted and expected, from the doctors that recommended it to the consumer patient that wanted to have a safe path forward and go get their medicine, hopefully at a pharmacy. We put together what we could. Nowadays, at these retail dispensaries, you're seeing much more standardized products presented to medical patients that have good tested quality to them. And as the adults want to experience the product, pricing is probably their biggest point of contention. Is the product priced correctly for my user experience? And if it is, I'm going to re-up again as I come back in the next month, the next week, depending upon what type of material that I might be working with. Now, getting to the end here, and I just want to quickly go over these factors because this, from a cultivator, it may be what's kind of affecting the process. And you, as a retailer or manufacturer, aren't going to see this, but you're going to need to judge some of these kink points, some of the pinch points of the industry. The cultivation technique could effectively change the outcome of the quality, whether they're growing in soil or hydroponically, can drastically affect the look, the feel, maybe not always the taste or the quality, but sometimes the end results of a COA when it comes to THC potency or terpenes. If it's not grown correctly in either one of those methods, you're going to see it and it's not going to show the same results. Remember the nurture effect. It's not always going to turn out the same if the technique is not the same or if it's drastically different compared to what the plant wanted. Remember, the plant, we're trying to make happy enough to get it to cultivate and then get harvested and get it in that process. And then it gets to the post-processing, the actual part that you're manufacturing it into a product that gets cut and manicured, how that process goes. Is it auto trimmed? Is it beaten up a lot? Is it catched correctly to begin the drying process in a steady, controlled environment so that it can be cured? If it's not dehydrated or dried out correctly in a very controlled way, there is no curing. And for those that don't know what curing is, it's a two-step. It's kind of a dance. You've got to dehydrate it a little bit to start the cure process. If it's too wet, it just molds and we don't even get to curing. So you're dehydrating or drying the flower out. A lot of outdoor growers, they kind of dehydrate and dry too fast because they're trying to dry a lot out and they want it all to get safe so that it doesn't mold. Because when we're cutting it, when it's wet, it's perishable. As soon as we start to get it a little dehydrated, we're drawing the analogy to converting a grape into a raisin. We're getting it dehydrated enough to then get it into a dried out state that has some supple spongeability to it. It squishes, but yet bounces back. It doesn't squeeze and then fall off the stalk, so to say. That is cured correctly. And the curing process makes it smell correctly. If it's not cured correctly, it's going to smell and taste like lawn clippings. If I dried it out in one day and then tried to cure it in a jar for the next month, it's going to smell like lawnmower clippings. If I slowly dehydrate it over 3 to 5 days, start to cure it over a week or two, now I'm going to make it smell like Granddaddy Purple or Trainwreck again. Because there is this time when you cut it off the vine, it smells very green, much more like chlorophyll, kind of like when you're mowing the lawn. And then if it's dry and dehydrated and then cured correctly, all of those flavors come back to the front. And then, of course, up to storage. It's got to be stored at low temperatures, controlled environments that are not getting humid or too dry. It can affect what the outcomes are, and usually closed canisters, right? It needs to be airtight because the risk of losing cannabis, the THC and the terpenes, is oxidation, air, and temperature. Those are our three must factors that you got to maintain and watch. Kind of fits in like wine, low temperatures, stored in areas that are very controlled and very low humidity normally. And usually you have safe, walkways. Now we're getting to just past 1 o'clock and I don't want to run too long. But we have some takeaways from today. And part of what the takeaway is that I think is important is that cultivars, while they're critical marketing tools, they may not be reliable for navigating the effects or even what the varietal is to begin with, because it might just be misnamed. Until we get some provenance, some national standards when it comes to naming, we're kind of in a little bit of a missing field here. But things are developing fast, and I think we're going to see much more walk away from sativa indica worlds that aren't necessarily scientifically correct categorizations. And they were mainly given by cultivators to identify the look of how it was grown, the feel about what was going on. And then it got crossed over into the effect and the feelings that the consumers were using, because that's the only thing they knew about the plant. They knew very little. And most growers didn't want to tell their consumers what to do because they were worried they were going to go grow it themselves. And so as we get beyond cultivars, there's going to be a lot of ways to discern quality and to navigate the user and consumer preferences that we're developing. Remember, we're building the plane on the fly, and all these consumers are coming on board, and most of them have had very little exposure to what we're doing. And as they get hold of it, they're becoming our best advocates. And if we train, identify, and educate them correctly, they're going to go out to their friend world and do the same thing and turn them all into hopefully avid folks that know what they're doing, and the exposure that they've had gives them a more educated pull from the shelf. Because especially in the extract world, cultivars may not be the best way to navigate. We're talking about batch products being made with multiple plants in multiple fields, and they're more labeling them towards what the COA shows the THC factor, and sometimes named after the farm and named after the region. And so these things are going to both be developed more and add to our provenance about why cultivation, why knowing the vendor, maybe the region that the plant was developed is super important. And I feel like we're in a spot now where I can get to almost stop here. And yeah, I'll let Angela take over, I think.
Thank you, Jeff. And I'd also like to note, since I missed it at the beginning when I was reading the bio, that Jeff's Patient ID Center prints Oaksterdam student ID cards and compliant staff cannabis badges at a low cost for cannabis businesses across California. We're dropping that information in the chat right now as well. I'd
Well,
also
and
like
I
to thank,
answered questions about getting folks just up to that compliance ability when it comes to badging, because not everybody needs to be badged, but retailers do. If you're consumer facing, you got to have some ability to identify the person that's doing that transaction. So I appreciate that, Angela.
right? And I would like to thank everybody for attending today, this informative webinar, which was offered by the City of Los Angeles Department of Cannabis Regulation Social Equity Program. The webinar recording will soon be available on DCR's website at cannabis.lacity.org. If you have any questions on accessing your LMFs account, please email dcr.sep@lacity.org. You can still get a professional business coach. This is a consultant dedicated to helping you succeed through that LMS. I'm Angela Baca with Oaksterdam University. We're grateful for your time and attention today. Thank you for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.